In this video, I'm going to explain why so many EV owners charge their cars more often than they actually need to, why that makes ownership feel more difficult than it really is, and how changing the way you think about charging makes the whole experience easier. By the end, you'll have a much clearer understanding of when you actually need to charge a car, when you don't, and why the wrong assumption here can create a problem where none exists. If you're new here, this is Wrench and Reason, where we explain how cars actually work. One of the biggest habits people fall into with EVs is the idea that the car should always be as charged as possible. Most people wouldn't describe it that way, but that's what shows up in behavior. They come home, plug in, or they run an errand, come back and plug in again. They see the battery at 70% and feel like it should be higher. They check it the next morning and use it as reassurance as if the car isn't really ready unless it's close to full. That instinct makes sense, especially if you're coming from gasoline. With a gas car, being low matters and refueling takes a separate trip. You can't just refill while the car is sitting there anyway, so you learn to stay topped off and avoid getting caught low. But an EV changes the structure of the problem. The question is no longer, will I have time to refuel later? The question is, do I already have enough energy for what I'm about to do plus a buffer? Once you start thinking that way, a lot of the charging behavior starts to look unnecessary. Most people are not operating anywhere near the limits of their battery. If your normal day is 15 miles to work, 15 miles home, plus a few stops, you're using a small fraction of what's available. Even if it's not perfectly efficient, you still are well within a large reserve. But because the battery percentage is always visible and it's easy to track, it pulls your attention toward restoring small amounts of energy that don't actually matter. That's where the mindset starts to work against you. Instead of the car supporting your routine starts organizing itself around the battery display. And once that happens, charging begins to feel like a constant responsibility, even though the car isn't actually asking for that. You can see this more clearly if you compare it to gasoline. So if someone uses a gallon of gas, they don't immediately think, I need to fill back up right now. People understand that the tank is there to be used over time. With EVs, many people do the opposite. They drive, see the percentage drop, and feel like the drop needs to be corrected, not because they're at risk, but because the number changed. That difference changes the entire experience. If every drop feels like something that needs attention, the car starts to feel demanding. If the battery is just something you use over time, the car starts to feel simple. And for most owners, simple is the more accurate description. Now, there is an important distinction. This isn't about never charging regularly, and it's not about waiting until the battery is low. It's about the difference between reflexive charging and intentional charging. Reflexive charging is when the number goes down, so you plug in. Intentional charging is when you look at what you actually need next and decide whether the car needs energy right now. That shift sounds small, but it changes almost everything. Because instead of asking, why isn't it full anymore, you start asking, do I have enough for what's next? And once you do that, the whole system becomes a lot simpler. So let's look at an example. Say you have about 250 miles of real usable range. You drive 30 miles on Monday, 25 on Tuesday, and another 35 on Wednesday. A lot of people will plug in all 3 nights, not because they need to, but because they're restoring the battery to a level that feels comfortable. But look at what's actually happening. After several normal days of driving, you still likely have far more energy than you need for the next day. The car isn't in trouble and nothing is being neglected. The battery is in fact doing exactly what it's supposed to do, and that's the part people tend to skip. The battery isn't there to stay full, it's there to be used and replenished when it makes sense. Once you see that clearly, the real question becomes what interval actually matches your life. And for some people, that may still be daily charging. But for many people, it doesn't need to be. In fact, it may be every few days. It's just really when the buffer actually starts to matter. This matters because overcharging behavior changes how people interpret the car. When the number drops, it feels like something needs attention even when nothing is wrong. And that creates unnecessary mental overhead. Charging feels constant, range feels less stable than it is, and the experience becomes about maintaining a number instead of understanding a system. And that's why new owners often describe EVs differently than experienced ones. At first, everything gets monitored. State of charge, efficiency, temperature, range, that's normal. But over time, most people stop reacting to the small changes because they learn what actually matters. That's when the experience settles down. Not when you learn more facts, but when you need less reassurance from the display. There's another side effect to charging too often. You never really learn how the car uses energy. If you're constantly resetting the battery after short trips, you don't see how it behaves across a normal stretch of driving. The system feels abstract because you're only interacting with its fragments. You understand it better when you let it run. You start to see what your commute actually costs, what happens at speed, what changes with weather, and what level of reserve actually feels comfortable. At that point, the battery stops being something you react to and becomes something you understand. This isn't about running the battery down and ignoring it. The goal isn't neglect, it's proportionality. You still want margin, and you still plan ahead for longer drives or unusual days. You still charge in a way that fits your setup and your comfort level, but those are decisions, they're not reflexes. And once charging becomes a decision instead of a habit, the car becomes much easier to live with. Here's a simple way to think about it. Your battery doesn't need your attention every time it changes. It needs your attention when what you have left no longer matches what you need next. That's the decision point, not the number moved and not it's lower than yesterday, just do I have enough with margin? For most people, the answer is yes more often than they realize. This is also where home charging gets misunderstood because its value isn't that it lets you constantly refill small amounts of energy. Its value is that energy is available when you actually need it. You don't have to use it every day to justify having it, you just have to know it's there. If your EV feels like something you always have to manage, it's worth asking whether the car is actually demanding that. Or maybe you're reacting to the battery the same way people react to a phone, where anything below a certain number feels uncomfortable even when there's plenty left. Cars aren't phones, and EV batteries aren't there to make you feel topped off. They're there to move you through real life, and for most people, real life doesn't require a reset after every small use. Once you see that clearly, charging starts to simplify. You stop thinking, I need to charge because I drove today, and you start thinking, I'll charge when I actually need more energy for what comes next. That's a much better way to live life with a car. If charging feels like maintaining a perfect number, the car starts to feel demanding. If it's just about having enough for the life you actually live, it usually gets much easier. This is Wrench and Reason, where we explain how modern cars actually work. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.